everyone and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to start my new lesson series called, I think I'm going to call it Beginners Dressmaking or Dressmaking for Beginners. I haven't quite decided yet. But I just want to do a series of really short videos to give you as much and as clear information as possible when you're reading through instructions and there's something that you don't quite understand. Hopefully you'll find a video on my channel to explain it. So today I thought I'd do seam allowances. So how to calculate seam allowances and keep them neat, and how to finish off seam allowances. So sometimes in a pattern it might ask you to finish that seam that you've just sewn, and people are like, what does that mean? So hopefully I will explain that too. And again, if you think that any more information is required and you want to help the community, then please comment below with anything useful and we'll get on with the video. One thing just before we start, I'm not wearing handmade again. I had a lot of comments on my last video about my top. I sometimes buy clothes, I'm sorry. This is a 90s print dress from H&M. I think it was like £6 or something, and I saw it and I thought it was perfect for holiday, but I do buy shop clothes as well so that I can copy them. I know it's really bad, but I do like copying clothes as well, so I think I'm going to make another one of these. You never know. Anyway, okay, so first I'm going to just show you this pattern. This is just a deer and doe pattern. So somewhere in a pattern booklet it should tell you what the seam allowances should be. So in this booklet, on the second page, it just says standard 5/8 seam allowances are included in the pattern. So this is in inches, this pattern. So sometimes patterns are in the metric system, so it would be, that would roughly be 15mm seam allowance. So I can just show you that now on the machine. There, on my Janome model, all the metric measurements are at the bottom and then the imperial ones are at the top. And now I also have measurements shown on the cover for my bobbin. So I have two lines of guys to work from, which is useful, especially as the imperial measurements are up here. Sometimes when I'm sewing something, it's nice to have a double check at the bottom where I line things up. On my machine, I also have some other measurements on the side for different angles and things like that, but we'll ignore those for now. So if I was working to 5/8 of an inch, I'd line up my fabric there at the top where that measurement is, and I just guide it round to the edge. So when it says seam allowances, join seams with the usual seam allowance, or sometimes it will just say join seam, see what the normal seam allowance is on your pattern, because unless it's stated, you will always go back to that measurement. Whereas sometimes, like in this book, for example, I can show you that yeah, so 111, it suddenly says stitch the back and fronts together, pin the pieces wrong side, stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and trim the seam allowance. So unless it's stated, you will always go back to that one measurement. So you would just line it up on here and then you just sew away. Some machines don't have a detailed grid like this one. Some may just have the measurement lines and not the actual measurements written on them. So the way you would find 5/8 of an inch or a 1/4 seam allowance or whatever is to use a tape measure or ruler. So the way you would do this is align the end of the tape measure up to the center point of where the needle sits. So on your normal foot on your machine, you should have a center point that you always work from to know where your needle is. And then you'd measure out from there along your tape measure, and then you'd pick the line nearest to that measurement. So if I was doing, say, 15mm, I would go along to measure this one, and then I'd see that this line is in line, so I would always work to this line. I'm lucky that my machine has them all written on, but that's another way that you would find it out. Again, using a ruler, maybe it's a bit more complicated using a ruler, but I can flip this one over. So say I was doing an inch seam allowance, I would line up 1 inch into the center where my needle is, and then whichever line the end falls on is the line I'd work from, so it would be this one. Luckily mine would say 1 inch on it. So I'm just going to sew my red fabric with a 15mm seam allowance, just so I can show you how to finish a seam. I hope these angles are clear enough for you. But now I'm going to talk about how to finish seams. So sometimes in a pattern it will just say finish the seam or trim and finish. So sometimes it doesn't explain clearly what that means. So I would always use my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, the way you'd finish a seam is by zigzag stitch on your usual machine. So on this one, I'm just going to pretend that the pattern requires the seam to be open. So ideally I would have ironed my seam open like so. So the way I'd finish those edges is to peel back that side. So say it was pressed flat like this. That's neat and lovely, but now I need to finish the raw edges. So I'd fold that back and just leave the seam edge, the raw seam edge here. And I would just use my overlocker to trim that away and finish the edge with my overlocker. But if you didn't have an overlocker, you could just cut the rest off and then zigzag, and I'll show you that one on the other side. Like that. So obviously the trick is to have the inside stitch line of your overlocking stitches not going over that center point, but pretty close to it to make a really neat edge. So from the other side you can see the distance between my stitching and my overlocker stitch. So now if you don't have the luxury of having an overlocker, it's really easy to do it on a normal machine. So I'm just going to show you on the other side. Sometimes a pattern will ask you to trim down the seam allowances, but normally go for about half if it doesn't say so, just so that it stops the seams being too bulky. So I'm just going to trim this away. And then I would put it on a zigzag. And then you just zigzag the very raw edge all the way along. And there you would have your finished raw edge with a zigzag. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you like it, and don't forget to comment below if you want to share any more useful information that you think the community might need to know, and I'll see you next week for another video. Happy handmade, everyone!